Hey everybody, this is Cannaday and this is Design Space. So basically, Tom asked me to make a video about designing my game Last Light. So he just wanted me to go through and talk a little bit about my process for designing and things like that. I just kind of wanted to share not only like how I came about designing this game and a little bit of the backstory behind it, but then also maybe some things you can glean about game design yourself. So if you're interested in game design or just interested in the process behind it, I know my process might be weird or very different from other designers. I definitely am not super knowledgeable as far as like end all be all of game design at all, and so many different people have so many different processes. But let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is my background a little bit. How can you figure this out? Just by knowing more about me might help you know a little bit more about how to design games. So I grew up playing games with my dad. My dad was huge into war games and a bunch of like old school games, but mostly the games that he taught us were things like Dune and things like that. The old school Dune that I played as a kid back in the day, and I grew up playing a bunch of like regular like mass market style games like Stratego and Monopoly. I remember playing Monopoly Junior with my brother a lot growing up as a kid. But as my dad started teaching me more of these hobby games and I played more and more video games, I was really intrigued with gaming in general. And even I started designing games, even I remember way back being a kid, you know. Like I would try to make my own games. Everybody as a kid pretends it has imagination. Designers are very much the same way. So you kind of like imagine how the mechanics or how different things would work. I remember playing with these little Z-bots back in the day and like using a ruler and being like, oh man, it'd be really cool if there was a game where I could move my Z-bots with the ruler and they had different stats, which I knew about a lot of stats from playing role-playing games with my dad. I played a lot of Gam World. Also playing a bunch of video games where you could like upgrade the stats of your character. So it's like, it'd be cool if there was like a tabletop game where you could measure stuff and everybody had different stats and they rolled different dice, not knowing that Warhammer existed at this time. But I was trying to like make up something very along the lines of Warhammer. I also played a lot of Gam World with my dad, like I said. We weren't allowed to play D&D as a kid, so me and my friend were basically like, man, it'd be really cool if there was, Gam World's like a post-apocalyptic role-playing game where you're all different mutants and things like that. I was like, it'd be cool if there was Gam World, but in fantasy. So me and my friends were trying to basically backwards engineer D&D from what we knew of Gam World, being like, it'd be cool if there were dwarves and elves and fairies and like daggers and swords and shields. And I remember even like we wrote up stats of all these different combat weapons and things like that, and like, oh, the dagger is going to be a D4 and the sword is going to be a D6, and it was very similar to how actual D&D is. But as kids we weren't really allowed to play or weren't like thrown into playing D&D just because I grew up in a religious household and we didn't do D&D, but Gam World was kind of like my dad's workaround to still get us to play role-playing games but not call it D&D. But yeah, so I've been designing and messing around with the idea of game design for forever. I grew up playing a bunch of CCGs and role-playing games, building decks and like trying to hone and do that stuff. I played in a bunch of tournaments and things like that. I feel like a lot of designers come from the Magic the Gathering world. I didn't play Magic the Gathering till much later in my life, until after I was 18, once again because growing up in a religious household. But I did play a ton of Magic and a ton of like Redemption, which is like a Christian version of a card game. And a lot of Pokemon as well when that was big. Just building decks and trying to figure out how to hone those decks and make decks that are gonna best my opponent, I feel like is a very good like way to like be like building your own deck is kind of like an introductory to like game design almost. And then also playing a lot of role-playing games. I started playing role-playing games. I grew up playing role-playing games with my dad, and then as I got older I started playing actual D&D, and then I ran a D&D campaign for 4th edition for like 2 years at a local game store. And I just had tons of people come in. I was running all sorts of games and then playing all sorts of games at like our different houses and things like that. And just being a part of like building your own world and making up stories together. And being a DM is a little bit like game design in its own right, because you're kind of making the rules up and trying to collaboratively build this story. So I feel like a lot of DM and like D&D game masters and things like that are very apt to like do their own game design. And then I do want to talk about everybody says that Last Light, oh, Roy's a first-time designer, which is true. But I feel like most designers out there have a lot of games that they have designed that never made it to market and are in the trash. Like I designed a post-apocalyptic card game called Alteration just because I grew up with Gam World so much I wanted to make this sort of thing. That ended up kind of like not happening. I made a fantasy 4X game that was too derivative of other 4X style games. I did a lot of things and made a lot of mistakes, but every single game that I tried to work on, tried to make, I still gleaned a little bit of information, a little bit of knowledge. I just didn't have the depth. I'd played board games, but I hadn't researched enough to know what would make a really good game. One of my games had player elimination and things like that. You have to like figure out what the market wants and what's gonna work really well so that way your game can work. So all of this happened. I kind of set aside game design and went into board game media and started doing a ton of that stuff. I had a podcast for the longest time called Epic Gaming Night, where we interviewed designers, interviewed all sorts of different people. And I talked to a bunch of different people and just kind of like let the designers do their thing. And I was like, game designing maybe isn't for me. You know, because I tried these designs out, they just weren't as good as I needed them to be. But then I want to get to my next topic here, which is research. So I really feel like if you're going to go into anything, especially game design, you really want to research the topic or anything in life in general. YouTube is a huge resource for being able to find out information about a topic. Like search up game design. Even if it's video game design, you can glean a lot of information about that. Some of the things that I like really paid attention to was Board Game University. Tom did a whole series of a podcast. I don't even know if it's online anymore, where he interviewed tons and tons and tons of different designers and like asked them a lot of questions about their game design. So listening to everybody talk about their game design and their process really helped me a lot. And then also Stonemeyer Games, Jamie Stegmaier does a lot of different series. He used to do a Kickstarter series on the Dice Tower, but then also he does a lot of videos where he talks about game design and how they run things at their company, and listening to a lot of that stuff also helped me like understand and think about game design. And then also Off the Page Games, Jay Cormier did a lot of videos about running a publishing company, and also especially like signing contracts and things like that for game designers. Just listening to a whole bunch of people that are knowledgeable about a subject and trying to glean information and understand. I did a lot of that before even working on starting to design Last Light. I tried to get as much information from the experts. You know, if you're gonna go out there in any project, you really want to try to understand. And then there's tons of podcasts out there where people talk about game design. Ludology is another great one where Jeff Engelstein used to be in charge of that a lot when I used to listen to it, but then there's a lot of different people who've been on there that make amazing content for that as well. And then just designer panels. I used to go to designer panels where designers would talk about their process. Just educate yourself on game design and what other designers are doing and what is working for them. Then just watch a massive amount of review videos. Just if any game is hot, you should understand why it's hot. If any game is good, you should try to figure out and glean what people are really enjoying. I mean, if you're gonna make a game, you want it to be successful, so you should try to see what other successful games look like. And then play tons of games. You want to have a catalog of games, or a catalog of mechanics and a catalog of ideas. And I know there's some designers out there that say, oh, I don't play anybody else's game, I just make my own. But you're still gleaning information from the industry and seeing different things. And the more games you play, the more you can understand how to bring out the fun in a game. So I basically had set game design aside and then kind of worked towards that. But then as I had an opportunity and I was working like nights and like during the day, I started working on game design again. I really wanted, I loved 4X games. I love Heroes of Land and Sea. I love Eclipse. I love Twilight Imperium. And I would make sure, I would always preach about how it's good to have like bring people over and like get people to play these games because they're such big, long, epic experiences. It's really hard to get them to the table. But I really wanted to make something that was very similar to that you could play in a single game night. So I do want to talk about the next thing is game ideas. How do you come up with the idea for your game? So the question is, why design a game? You really want to be passionate about whatever game you're designing, because if you're not passionate about it, no one else is going to be. And if something's not working in your game, you're going to be the one that needs to like fix it and figure out how to get it together. And once again, ideas are a dime a dozen. Like millions of people come up with tons of different board game ideas. The idea itself is not really worth anything. It's actually implementing the idea, prototyping and playtesting the idea and getting the game down on paper and making sure it happens. And then another thing when you're thinking about making your game is you have to have that research to be able to know, does this game stand apart? Why make the game if like there's other games out there like that already? You can go out and just play that game instead. So your game either has to be better or different, you know? So you have to figure out a way to make it so your game stands apart in the industry. So if you're looking at your game, it's like, well, this other game's like it. Everybody else is going to be comparing your game to other games. Like, and regardless of what game it is, people are going to be, oh, this game is like that game is like this game, and they're going to be like, which one's better? So if your game isn't different or better in some way, then your game is not going to be able to stand apart in the industry. So the idea is not something that you should pursue necessarily. And then crafting your ideas or crafting my ideas. So I'm kind of a very weird like game designer that I think about a game a lot before I even make a prototype for it. Like I do a lot of like thinking in my head of like what mechanics I want. Like I think, okay, I really want to make a game in this theme. Mostly a lot of times for me, it's because that game doesn't exist and I really want to play it. And sometimes there has been cases out there where I'm like, man, I really want to play a fast-playing Fantasy 4X game. I should make that. And then a game like Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea came out, and I ended up just pursuing and playing that one instead. And I just really like want to design games that I want to play and that I want to see a space in the industry and something that I think would be good for other people to be excited about as well. So yeah, I do a lot of thinking and crafting these ideas and kind of like working towards what mechanics would work. I mean, I've had whole games where I'm just like thinking about ideas and being like, man, this game doesn't stand apart or isn't good enough. What's a hook? What's a twist that makes this game different from other games? What is a mechanic that I can come up with? Or it's like, oh, I've seen this kind of mechanic. Maybe I should change it and make it completely different in this way or that way. I know I'm weird because I do a lot of things inside my head. Like I'll be dreaming at night or like riding on a plane trip or just washing dishes or mowing the lawn. Any of those things can like bring on game design ideas. And normally when you're bored or doing those tasks that are repetitive, it's a lot of time where you can be inside your head thinking about different game designs and ways to twist and change those things. So I really work hard on crafting and honing my ideas even before my prototyping step, which I'm sure a lot of designers are like, you don't know if it works until you get it on paper, which is very true, but I try to skip a lot of heartache of changing things over and over again just by thinking about the game so much and trying to hone those ideas. And then also I want to say that when I'm doing this, I'm trying to figure out the shortest and quickest way to kind of get to my goal in the game. I want to make the game as accessible as possible, lower as many barriers of entry. I know there's gigantic like Euro games where there's all these different hieroglyphs and symbols and things, and like complexity is a feature of the game, and trying to figure out how the game actually works is a feature. I really want to make my games intuitive and accessible and bring down as many barriers of entry as possible so that way the game can be enjoyed with as many people as possible. And that's one thing that's a really big deal for me, is making sure a game is accessible so that more and more people can play and enjoy the games I create. And that's one of the really big things I try to do with Last Light. Is 4X is a big, huge, daunting genre. And with Last Light, I tried to take that genre and make it more accessible, not just because of the time frame, but just because of how intuitive the cards kind of work. The cards just kind of make sense. Everything is kind of right there in front of you. And of course, I've made some missteps. I feel like I really should have made a how to play video a long time ago. I was holding out for other people doing that, but I probably should go ahead and make my own how to play so that way people can more easily jump into the game and be taught by me how to play the game. And then also, like, rule books are so hard, like just making sure I had a ton of people look at my rule book, and all these things are barriers of entry. You really want to make sure your game is accessible and be thinking about those things even when you're in the idea step. And then when do you know your ideas are ready for prototyping? I think really when you feel like the mechanics are in a really good spot in your head, or maybe you want to start like prototyping stuff out, you can really start prototyping at any point once you feel like you have a strong idea of how you want the mechanics to work for the game. We'll talk about prototyping in a future video, but it's really about just whatever you feel. When you're like, this game deserves to actually be put in the effort to prototyping. Prototyping is one of the hardest parts of designing a game. You really want to make sure that your idea is solid and worth actually pursuing before going into the prototyping phase. And like I said, ideas don't really mean a whole lot of anything, but when you're out there trying to make it happen. But yeah, so that is a little bit about Last Light and a little bit of my thought process behind game design. Next time we're going to talk about prototyping and playtesting, which is really, really the biggest part of game design overall. Those are huge components of game design, and I'll share a little bit about how I went about doing all that with Last Light. Anyway, I do want to thank you guys so much for joining me, and I definitely want to thank Tom for letting me do this video talking about my game design for Last Light. And I hope you guys are enjoying the game, and I hope you guys are enjoying all sorts of different games. And if you're out there designing, make sure to leave in the comments down below that, hey, I'm a designer, let me know if you got any enjoyment or any things about this. I know my design process might be weirder just because I'm so introspective, but hopefully you were able to get something good out of this. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you on the next one.